You've just received a poor grade on a test. You think to yourself, that test was rather difficult. That's the reason I scored poorly. But was that really it? Did you attribute it to that action or that circumstance instead of thinking about whether you could have studied harder? This is one of the situations dealing with psychology and human behavior that the attribution theory seeks to explain. During this speech, we're going to explain how this theory can be used to explain people's behavior in everyday life, how it encourages better communication between individuals. We'll provide you with a history of the theory for you to be informed on the various attributes that behavior can be attributed to. Eventually, we will lead into a discussion of other terms and models that we come across more frequently today. Some of these terms include things that you're familiar with, probably are familiar with, such as cognitive dissonance and confirmation bias. A model that is the more up-to-date model that we use today for these various attributions is known as the covariation model. Finally, we'll go over how the theory is beneficial, how it helps to find rational reasons to questions about a person's behavior, as well as how parental figures can use this theory to their advantage with their children, helping them to reach out and better understand the attributes that influence their child's behavior.
The attribution theory proposed by Fritz Heider is a theory that can be used in everyday life. According to Bernard Weiner, who elaborated on Fritz's theory, gives insight that internal and external causes contribute to the effect of a person's behavior. Weiner explains that how one perceives the cause of an outcome can determine motivation for that individual, despite whether the outcome was positive or negative. Because you attribute your personal successes and failures according to your own internal and external devices, the attribution theory encourages you to analyze those factors and apply different strategies for success. Knowing of this theory can help leaders, as well as the average Joe, to influence their students, employees, or the public in a positive way. For example, a teacher being sure to accommodate a student with a learning disability so the student has every opportunity to succeed from the external factor, and encouraging the child verbally to assist with the child's internal factors. The success or failure will then depend upon the student's own controlled factors. The attribution theory also encourages better communication because of the need to understand how people create their meaning and how they interpret events. For example, average Joe encounters a grumpy barista who is being impatient when taking his order during the lunch rush. Average Joe can deduce objectively that the barista may be stressed or overwhelmed with the workload. Therefore, because the attribution theory encourages an individual to analyze behavior and/or circumstances, they can respond to the other accordingly, which in this case could be with a little understanding and forgiveness or grace. Because the attribution theory is helpful and can be used in everyday life, makes it just as important because it can help an individual to understand themselves and others better.
We've presented you with a lot of information so far. I'd like to cover the history of the theory now. The attribution theory was first published in The Psychology of Interpersonal Relationships by Fritz Heider in 1958. This theory, according to Martinko, aims to provide the framework necessary to understand how individuals explain why events in their environment happen. So Heider noticed two types of attributions, dispositional and situational. Situational attribution is the tendency to attribute one's behavior to an external situation or circumstance. For instance, when someone's yelling at you when it's hot outside, they're being unkind, you may attribute the cause of their unkind behavior to the sun, perhaps that's affecting them. In contrast, the dispositional theory, or the dispositional attribution, is the tendency to attribute the cause of one's behavior to an internal characteristic about them. So an example of this would be that someone's cutting in front of you in line at a grocery store, and you assume that this person they're rude and they're a bad person, and so this internal characteristic about them is actually what influenced them to make the decision to cut in line. The attribution theory that is most well known today deals with these two types of attribution, and it is Harold Kelly's covariation model. This was developed in 1967. Kelly's idea was that when people attempt to discover the cause of people's behavior, they specifically look at three areas: consensus, distinctiveness, and consistency. So his model was ultimately is a logical judge, so to speak, for whether a particular behavior or act is dispositional or situational. It's a model that hopes to go through a series of sets or standards that helps to explain the behavior as one or the other. So later on, the attribution theory would develop into other more common areas and psychological theories talked about today. Some of those that we're more familiar with are things such as cognitive dissonance, or the fundamental attribution error, or confirmation bias. We all know what those are, and those all have their roots in the attribution theory. They're all linked. However, the attribution theory has not been immune to criticism. This theory has been critiqued as reductionist, for example. It doesn't. So one of these critiques is that it doesn't consider social, cultural, or historical factors that mold or could also attribute to the cause of these attributions.
The attribution theory is very beneficial for an individual because it helps find rational reasons to answer the question why, or why is this individual acting this way, or why I'm acting this way. The two main types that are discussed are dispositional and situational. Dispositional attributes the question why to the personality, beliefs, or motives of an individual. And situational attributes the question why to external factors such as the weather or the environment affecting the individual. Once the type of attribution is determined, then consistency is needed to back up whether to attribute a certain factor to answer the question why. When this theory is applied correctly, it is very helpful because it helps find patterns in one's behavior. Parental figures may find this useful with their children. By keeping an open mind to whether or not outside factors may cause a child to act out, will help establish better communication and relationship with the parent and the child as they develop. Professors and teachers may find this useful as well in their classrooms. By taking the time to really look for patterns in a particular student's grades dropping while the majority of the class's grades are rising or stagnating throughout the weeks, can open up room for communication with the student. By reaching out to understand whether or not to attribute the drop in grades due to the teaching methods, or if the student is having outside factors affecting their work. Managers may find this useful in who they employ. If one employee has consistently been lacking in their quality of work, despite counseling and being in different positions, then the manager may use this theory to determine whether or not to keep this employee employed. The attribution theory is very helpful because it helps find patterns into one's behavior and opens up communication to understand one's behavior.
In conclusion, with the introduction of Heider's attribution theory in The Psychology of Interpersonal Relations, people have the opportunity to make sense of the world, or at least try to understand the actions and causes of why people do what they do. With a bit of presumption, inspection, and judgment, the attribution theory helps shed light on the observational habits that people seem to partake in. This can also lead to further branches off of Heider's theory with Bernard Werner's attribution theory of motivation and Harold Kelly's covariation model. The simple question of why did they say that, or can you believe that happened to her, are common inquiries in this day and age. With the speed with which we perceive and receive information thanks to smartphones, social media, and various other outlets, a majority of really good information or posts leave us wondering, how can people be so? We question if an act of kindness is genuine or are there underlying intentions. Uncertainty is thought of when an individual commits an act of violence or decides to harm only themselves. The best way to truly know the answers to these questions is to get to know the person at a meaningful level. If not, then the questions and speculations can remain. The attribution theory at least helps to by giving us a step towards understanding the behavior and psychology of other people. However, even when we think we truly know somebody or understand a situation, we can still be surprised by their actions through the various blessings and trials of life. This theory isn't entirely foolproof when concluding the character of an individual or group from another's observation and judgment. Time and a relationship, if warranted, are needed to truly make sense of one's speculative judgment over another's words or actions.